Hi there, Brian D. Anderson joining you for another edition of The Q. Today we're going to discuss how to improve your writing, just a few tips on how to get you closer to your goals. So sit back and listen up.
Welcome to The Q with Brian D. Anderson.
Now, this isn't going to cover very many details on the subject of how to improve your writing. People go to college for years to learn how to be a professional writer. What I'm going to try to cover here is some of the basic stumbling blocks and basic missteps that aspiring authors tend to make. Dialogue is one of the first things I notice when I am critiquing a aspiring writer's work, whether or not it's framed properly, whether or not it flows well, whether or not it's a realistic conversation that can be had in the actual world. So I'm going to give you some tips and a little bit of advice on how to improve your dialogue. The use of dialogue tags can be tricky. First of all, stop avoiding the word said if that's what you're doing. 9 times out of 10, your character said it. They didn't exclaim it, shout it, scream it, whatever. You don't need flowery language to explain that your character said something. And if you do avoid the word said, it becomes obvious that that's what you're doing. I actually did that early on in my career, and it was pointed out to me. Now, in a 2-person conversation, dialogue tags are not necessarily required. Still, for flow purposes, you might want to use them occasionally, and that's going back to the earlier tip about using your text-to-speech. You can kind of listen back and see if Jane said is appropriate to put on a particular line of dialogue. Now, it's important to remember that conversations aren't static. So in place of dialogue tags, you can use action. Bill leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes downturned, period. Boom. Conversation. Especially in a 3, 4, 5-person conversation, this assigns the dialogue to the character, gives the scene some dynamics, sets the mood. So because with his elbows on his knees and his eyes downturned, that sort of indicates to the reader an emotion or that the character is experiencing. Head jumping is something to avoid. Now, I know some writers do it and they do it effectively. I'm not a fan of it. And as a reader, it's jarring to me, even when it's this sin is committed by writers who I enjoy. Now, head jumping, in case you don't know, is telling the story from multiple perspectives within the same chapter or scene. Now, there are ways to get away with it, and there's ways to, get away with it effectively and not have it be jarring, and I'm about to cover that. But when you're telling a story and you have your protagonist and you're using their inner dialogue and you're using their perspective, suddenly going to the inner dialogue and perspective of somebody with whom they are traveling or speaking to is just not good, good writing for the most part. So avoid doing that. Now, if you feel you need to and you feel there needs to be a change in perspective, there's something called a chapter break. And what I do is I end a paragraph, 3 asterisks, bump, and it's almost like a chapter within a chapter, and then I change the perspective there. It's usually when 2 characters within a scene or multiple characters within a scene part ways, and you want to go from the perspective that you held initially to the perspective of whoever was left behind or went in a separate path. And it's not appropriate for a new chapter, or so there are instances you can do it, but avoid head jumping. You don't want the reader's experience to be a series of stops and starts and jarring moments. Now, this little tip has less to do with the craft of writing and more about storytelling. And For a gamer, this would be a side quest. Now, when you're writing a massive epic, especially if it's going on into multiple volumes and, hundreds of thousands of words, it can be difficult to stay focused on the main storyline because a lot of times you acquire new characters and all of a sudden your cast is enormous and you're trying to tell a story that becomes difficult to wrap your arms around. So avoiding these little tangents and side quests that have nothing to do with the plot itself and doesn't really move anything forward, no matter how interesting to you as a writer, might not be so interesting to the reader. If the main quest is finding the sword and slaying the dragon, that's great. Now, having the hero, run into some trouble in a village, that's okay. But if that, pushes them off into this whole new direction that has nothing to do with the main plot, this can be problematic. Now, side quests and little tangents can be character building moments. So don't get me wrong. It's not that they don't have their uses, it's their overuse. And it's when you spend too much time on it and, too little time on the main story and too much time on these little tangents that your storytelling starts to suffer and the reader will start to get irritated. Information dumps is one of the most common mistakes an aspiring writer makes, giving out information they feel the reader needs to further the story, when in fact the reader doesn't need this information. I love the way Brandon Sanderson covers, these in some of his lectures. And I love the way he drips and drabs information. The learning curve that I experience with his novels is, for me, just spot on. It's one of the reasons I enjoy his writing so much. Now, if you're wondering whether or not you are committing an information dump sin, ask yourself, if you were the reader and you didn't know a piece of information, would this story still be interesting? Now, there's a little story I sort of made up in my head about how to, drip and drab information. You have a guy, he's waking up and he grabs a necklace with a broken latch, and you give it some kind of cool name and he looks at it displeased, shoves it in his pocket, and he, on his way to get it fixed, is mugged. The thing is stolen. And he recognizes the muggers, but they beat him senseless, and he wakes up in his house with his wife, his children surrounding his bed, and the constable. And when the constable asks, he said he was was on his way back home from getting the locket fixed, and that it was not stolen, that he was just mugged and a few coins taken off of him during the robbery. Now, what I've done here is I've created a bunch of questions and that can be discovered for later. Instead of saying, hey, the locket is an important part of that particular culture that you must possess in order to trade or buy and sell, and, without it, you can't feed your family, and that he didn't want the constable to know that it had left his possession, even though he knew the muggers. He needed to try to solve this problem himself. Now, I didn't give that information out initially because that would be an information dump. I left it to be discovered along the way. Now, I know it's hard not to use exposition, because you sometimes feel that the reader must know this, otherwise they'll lose interest. And it's just not true. You got to think of it in terms of yourself as a reader, and think about the books you've enjoyed and how much information you discovered later on that, even had you known early on, it just wouldn't have been as fun a read. So avoiding information dumps is key. It's key to good storytelling, it's key to good writing, and it's key to the enjoyment of the reader. The last thing I'm going to cover is lag time and travel. Too much is way too much. An entire chapter dedicated to a character traveling from one city to the next is, most of the time, it's boring unless there's some compelling reason, if there's a way you're building the plot. Now, I've seen, again, I'm going to mention Sanderson. Sanderson does this with often, but he does it. But Sanderson, he's actually adding little pieces of information within the travel that pay off later. But what he's not doing is spending page after page of describing the mountains and trees and telling about how tired everybody is at the end of the day and having some useless conversation around a campfire, that goes on. You just don't need all that. I mean, sometimes you don't need to cover the travel much at all. You could cover the travel time in a simple paragraph of it, the trip being uneventful, especially if there's really nothing to further the plot within that travel time. So this really plays to pacing. And as you become more experienced and you sort of come into your own when it, as far as you're acquiring your own voice and your own style, you'll also acquire a way you pace a story. And what I just described can really slam the brakes on your pacing and jar the reader out of the enjoyment they might be experiencing. And that's the last thing in the world you want to do. You want the reader to enjoy all of your work, which is often difficult, but at least the majority of it. You don't want them flipping ahead to find out when the plot picks back up. So that's about all the tips I have for today. And I hope they've helped. And I hope you are staying safe. And remember, like, subscribe, and if you want to support this channel, click on the Patreon page. It's the money will go directly to my trip around the country to visit bookstores once the country opens up. So until next time, this is Brian D. Anderson, and this is The Cube.